We tackled everything we could do prior to hitting record to create the anamorphic look. Yet, there are still many ways to create the anamorphic look through the power of post-production, even after your project is in the can. Some of these techniques require a lot of time and fiddling, but others are super easy and definitely worth doing. Adding distortion can make for super convincing results, and flares can be created in many different ways. I'm going to skim over software-specific details and focus on what kind of results you can achieve. Vashi Nedomansky's Anamorphic 40 is the only free template to simulate anamorphic distortion in After Effects. The Anamorphic 40 is inspired by Panavision's Primo 40mm lens. The Anamorphic 40 works through a combination of Bezier warp, vignette, and blur, and it has been downloaded thousands of times. A film's aspect ratio is determined by its horizontal measurement divided by its vertical measurement. 16:9 aspect ratio means that for every 16 horizontal units, there are 9 vertical units. You can also simplify it by doing 16 divided by 9, which we will round up to 1.78. And that means that the horizontal dimension of the frame is 1.78 times longer than the vertical dimension. Through history, film has gone through multiple different aspect ratios, and we have talked about that in the cookbook. When the anamorphic format started its Hollywood life, movie theaters were losing audiences to television, so they had to crank up the experience of going to the theater. The solution was making the screen impossibly wide when compared to tiny 4:3 TVs. Which aspect ratio is proper cinemascope then? Originally, cinemascope meant 2.35:1. In the 1970s, some technical specs were updated and the format was adjusted to 2.39:1. But in today's age of internet video, the choice is really up to you. The difference is tiny though, only 28 pixels at 4K between 2.35 and 2.39. Deciding the aspect ratio of your project before you shoot is extremely important. Many cameras and most monitors offer some type of overlay on the image that displays your desired final aspect ratio. The name and location in the menu can change for each manufacturer, so dig deep. If the number offered by your camera is not exactly what you want, that is still better than no guide. Just pick the closest option and roll with it. If I want my project to be in 2.39, but my camera only gives me 2.35:1 overlays, that is good enough for now. This will help greatly when framing on set and simplify your life in post. When conforming 16:9 footage to CinemaScope, you have two options: masking and cropping. Both of them involve discarding roughly 25% of the original frame. Masking is also known as letterboxing, and it consists of adding black bars on the top and bottom of the frame. This does not effectively change the dimensions of your video. Templates for masking are easy to make. All you need to do is drop one of these masks on a video track above your footage and make the mask duration the same as your video. Cropping involves changing your timeline settings. You will adjust the timeline's height based on the frame's width. To find your new setting, divide your frame width by the chosen aspect ratio, and that'll give you the frame's new height. You can also use my aspect ratio calculator and leave the squeeze factor at 1. Let's say I filmed my project in Cinema 4K 4096 by 2160 pixels, and I want to output with a 2.39:1 aspect ratio. So I take 4096 and divide it by 2.39. Hence, the frame height is 1712 pixels. Now I know my timeline width will be 4096 pixels, but the height has to be adjusted from 2160 to 1712. One of the main advantages of cropping over masking is when using screens wider than 16:9. Nowadays, we have lots of phone screens and monitors that are 17:9 or even 21:9. A masked project will show black edges on all sides, as it is optimized for a 16:9 screen, while a cropped one will use the most screen area in comparison. If you need detailed tutorials on how to change your sequence settings on Premiere, After Effects, Resolve, or Final Cut Pro X, the Anamorfake guide includes those videos and instructions. Most lenses have some sort of distortion. A clear and easy example of what I mean by that is the bulging effect that makes the image seem like it's popping out of the screen. This is an extreme example of barrel distortion. Anamorphics have a very unique type of distortion that is a trademark of the look. It is somewhat similar to barrel distortion, but stronger on the horizontal lines than on the vertical lines. This distortion is much more noticeable on wide angles as you see more of the environment around the characters. Look at these bendy horizontal lines at the top and bottom of Wes Anderson shots. One way to add distortion is to apply it to your final frame, pushing the center pixels outward and holding down the corners. Sometimes the result is weird on centered frame subjects, making them balloon up. What if I tell you there's a smarter way of doing it? One that won't warp your subject's faces. My strategy benefits from having a crop or a mask applied in the previous steps. We are not showing those 25% top and bottom of the original footage, but they still exist. We can pull some of the original corner data back into the shot to achieve the bendy horizontal lines while keeping the center of the frame untouched. Here, I am using the same value to compare both distortions, and the results are quite different. The inward approach maximizes the use of your footage and holds a more natural look. If you look at the squares around the center area, the outward ones are stretched, while corners stay neutral. On the inward distortion, the center is neutral and the corners are compressed, much more anamorphic-like. Here, it's not the lens, but you who's in control of the distortion being added. Keep in mind, distortion should be stronger in wide angles like 28 or 35 millimeters and get more subdued as your focal length gets longer. I found my best results in After Effects through a custom-made preset. I'm sharing this preset in our Discord server, and you can get access to it by becoming a Super 35 member of the channel. This is the general idea. I'll load my footage, apply a mask over it to conform to CinemaScope aspect ratio, then under the mask, create an adjustment layer and apply the Bezier warp effect to distort the original footage. The Ana-Distort preset has already automated the Bezier warp, so distortion is applied evenly on all corners. Positive values on the corner slider will create barrel distortion, while negative values will create pincushion distortion. Bokeh is one of the most coveted anamorphic traits. The so-called waterfall bokeh is a big boost in production value, giving each shot a paint-like quality. In previous episodes, we covered how to achieve the anamorphic bokeh through the use of aperture discs. But if you want or have to do it in post-production, there is still hope. The Lego Movie is a great example that the anamorphic look can be achieved completely through the use of digital tools. The biggest downside of creating bokeh in post? It is an incredibly time-consuming process, and I would only recommend it for short shots or pickups that did not use the same gear used in principal photography. Why is it so time-consuming? Because it involves rotoscoping the elements you want to keep in focus. And if you want to be really accurate, you will want to break down your out-of-focus areas in different layers with different levels of defocus, a simplified simulation of reality. Rotoscoping is one of the oldest techniques in the visual effects world, and it means to manually separate elements in the footage through the use of animated mats. There are plenty of ways to go about making those mats, and plenty of good tutorials on the subject out there. The ideal shots for cheating over bokeh are the ones with considerable depth of field, since it is easier for the software to pick up the highlights and blow them into bokeh accordingly. Be mindful on your approach. It is easy to overdo this effect and end up with an unrealistic result because depth of field feels too shallow for the field of view. Here's a raw shot from Ichidomo, shot spherical. See the round bokeh? We want to turn these into ovals. In these situations, we'll be applying a lens blur to the background and customizing the out-of-focus shape. After the blur levels are set, we start rotoscoping the character back on top of his blurred self. That usually takes a while. Doing this shot took me about 90 minutes. At the end of that, you'll need to do a little bit of work to clean up the edges around the character that look a little off. If you're watching for small imperfections, there are some to be found. The brighter edges around the character over a darker background are a consequence of the lens blur. See his shoulder on the left? I am sure these would go unnoticed in a video though. Flares are a staple of anamorphics that make filmmakers drool. Unfortunately, as we saw earlier, cheating flares with wires introduces one or more lines through your bokeh. To some folks that is acceptable, to others, post-production is the best option. The Optical Flares plugin is one of the best investments if you ever consider adding flares in post-production. The level of customization and control is enormous. The price is great, and there are lots of detailed tutorials about all of its features. Its biggest advantage is the flares here are multi-dimensional, composed of several different layers that move at different pace, giving a much better impression of what a real flare does. I have used optical flares in countless projects, including some that were shot as a mix of anamorphic and spherical, and I wanted to match the look of the lenses. Optical flares allows you to stick flares to a tracked point of a shot if you want very strict control. But you can also generate flares based on luminance levels of the footage. These luminance-based flares are so effective, they helped me trick a lot of people with This Is Scope April Fool's video a few years ago by using digital flares to enhance anamorphic and anamorfake footage. Each shot that you put through optical flares becomes its own time drain though. These are not 5-minute solutions and require a fair amount of finessing. Fortunately, these are not the only options, and there is a much simpler approach that can work for quick shots and boosting your production value. To begin, you'll need stock footage of lens flares over a black background. As a quick start, CinePacks offers you 13 free samples, and their paid packs offers you a lot more options. You won't have trouble finding good flare footage. Once you have your timeline set up, import the flares into your project and pick the ones you like best. Drag one on a video layer above your shot and change its blending mode to Add or Screen to preserve the highlights of the flare footage and discard the shadows. You can change many things about your stock flare, such as scale and position, and adjust its contrast and saturation with a little color correction applied to the flare footage alone. You can even change its color completely by rotating the hues. The downside of this technique is the flares are hardly in sync with the actual camera movement. Because of this mismatch, you can end up spending a lot of time trying to find the best combination between your shot and the available stock footage. This video barely scratches the surface of how much you can enhance the look of your footage through post-production to craft the anamorphic look. I didn't touch on color correction or film emulation processes, which should be subject for another episode. Hopefully, you get some ideas to experiment with or decide to get the PDF guide and full tutorials to execute them faster. On the next video, we'll wrap up our journey by looking at the combination of all these techniques and the trick of pairing them with actual anamorphics to create a look that'll have people scratching their heads trying to decipher what you used. I hope you're enjoying this series as much as I'm enjoying making it. Anamorfaking is by far the cheapest way to go into the anamorphic look, and now you're equipped with all the knowledge. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you on the next one. Chito Ferradans, out.